In this video we're going to discuss small business. We're going to look at various features of small business and some issues associated with dealing with small business in terms of definition, what they are, their purpose, their advantages and disadvantages, and just generally about this very important sector of any economy, the small business sector. At the outset, it's necessary to define what's meant by a small business. Just to simply say a small business doesn't really mean a lot. It depends on people's perspective. Some people may think small business is up to 100 workers, let's say. Some people may think that a small business involves less than £100,000 of investment. So people may have different definitions of small business, and to be consistent we should aim at having a definition of small business. And it's necessary for two reasons. First of all, the government, to help small business to grow, it must know what's meant by small business in this context. The government has all sorts of policies aimed at growing this, as I said, important sector. It's an important sector because we know it creates a lot of employment and is responsible for a lot of output in the economy. But if the government's going to help small business, then it needs to know what's meant by small business. What is a small business? Otherwise, some of the government's efforts would go to the wrong category of business. So it's important that the government understands what's meant by small business, and to understand it we should have some sort of definition or some sort of concept, an agreed concept about what is meant by small business. For statisticians and planners who want to measure the contribution to the economy from this sector, they also will have a vested interest, a real interest in what's meant by small business. If it's going to be used by statisticians, then they need to know what is a small business before they can count them. Otherwise they may be counting different types of business. They may be counting medium-sized business. Although there again we'd need to know what's meant by medium-sized business. Just simply saying the word doesn't tell us a lot. So what's meant by small business? And that's important if statisticians are going to measure the size of this particular sector. So there must be agreed criteria for defining what is meant by small business. Now, a precise definition may be based on such factors as the number of employees in the firm. This is a simple way of defining the size of the firm. The problem with this approach is that it ignores the capital intensity of the processes within the firm. If we were to say that small businesses have less than, say, 50 workers, but it doesn't tell us a lot, because some companies are quite large and very important simply because they have very few workers but very sophisticated machinery. So one worker may have the output which would otherwise require hundreds of workers perhaps, because the machines are capable of very advanced programming and very advanced work. There may be computer aided manufacturing techniques. There may be the machines are very automated, very technologically advanced. So it only requires one worker to do a lot. But that worker may actually just be maintaining the machine. It's the machine that does the work. So trying to get a definition of small firms based on the number of workers is problematic as well. It sounds easy. It sounds like the right way to do it. Count up the number of employees. But it varies dramatically according to the technological equipment that's within the firm. Could look at the monetary value of the firm. This way of defining the size of the firm ignores the number of employees and the capital intensity of the firm. The monetary value of the firm may be related to the market price that is commanded by the product. So using the monetary value of the firm also has problems. The issue of how many workers or what type of machinery the company's got. These are not really addressed by the monetary value. And also, the last point here is that the firm, in any case, is really determined by its success or failure in the marketplace, and that may vary from time to time. So our two approaches are somewhat weakened. The third approach, is some combination of measures. It sounds a little abstract and a little vague. This may weigh the other approaches into a single combined measure. So perhaps it may be possible to look at the number of employees and the monetary value of the business and try to work out some sort of average based on the two of them, some sort of weighted average. But it's not a very precise measure. So this problem of definition is important. We still need to know what we're talking about. What is a small business? In 1971, the Bolton Committee reported, and this defined small business as those employing fewer than 200 employees. This was refined in 1981 when the Companies Act distinguished between small and medium-sized firms. So the governmental approach is to just simply state a figure and that, in a sense, that's it. That is the definition. It's I suppose it's possible for governments to do things like that, but as business people or economists or statisticians, they may be more worried about having a precise and clear definition. The Companies Act 1981 set out criteria, and it assessed the size of the firms and the satisfaction of at least 2 out of 3 criteria. So this approach, it set out some criteria for the definition of small firms, and then if at least 2 of those criteria were in place, were met, then a company would be a small business. If 2 of the boxes could be ticked, then it would be a small business. These were as follows. Say the maximum turnover. Now we're going back here quite a bit in time, so these figures are not really that relevant, but they're widely quoted as these figures. But we need to have the more up-to-date figures. But I wanted to talk about the original, and to that extent we'll use these particular figures. So the maximum turnover, maximum £2.8 million. The medium-sized firm, the maximum turnover will be £11.2 million. The maximum value of the assets, £1.4 million. For a medium-sized company, £5.6 million. Maximum number of employed for a small firm, 50. And for a medium-sized, the maximum number employed would be 250. So now we've got criteria. We've got some standards of measurement. And being somewhat pragmatic, it was suggested that if 2 of these boxes were ticked in the context of any one particular company, then it would fall into whatever size it was ticked. It could be classified as small or as medium or whatever. So it's one approach, and it's one that is used. Small and medium-sized enterprises are now considered to be an important sector in the economy. They're responsible for a significant proportion of output, and they are diverse so that they can better survive economic cycles in the economy. So now there's a lot of interest in small firms because they are very robust. They can withstand a lot of ups and downs in the economy. They're very flexible. They're able to bend with the current market situation, and they're able to bend more precisely and with greater agility than, say, the bigger firms who may have a lot of assets committed to a certain number of products, and in a sense they're locked in. The smaller firms can adjust, but they're also a very significant purchaser of labour, and they're a very significant part of the economic life of the economy. So it's important that they are understood, and for that reason, ever since the Bolton report in 1971, there's been widespread interest in this very little understood, or certainly nowadays there's a lot of reports and a lot of academic interest, but in the past very little understood sector of the economy. Now, the growth of the firm. Well, in economies, in economies, but in economics also, the word scale means size. So when we talk about the scale of a firm, we're generally talking about the size of the firm. We would measure the size of the firm, generally speaking, by the amount of output it produces. Orthodox economic theory assumes that firms wanted to grow and maximize profits. But at least that's a perspective that's often put around about economists, that they believe this. Certainly an area in economics called the theory of the firm started life as looking at profit maximization as a model, as an abstraction, to try and understand the motivation of companies. But economists have added to that significantly over the years, and there have been many models put forward that may partially explain the behavior of companies. Models such as, for example, sales maximization, the growth of sales maximization hypothesis, behavioralism, which is used in economics but maybe belongs to a different subject area. There are many models put forward by economists to try and get a greater insight into how companies are motivated and what they do. I think economists nowadays are much more confident about themselves and about their discipline, and are willing to look to other subject areas to get insights into the behavior of companies. So it's probably fair to say that orthodox economics started with ideas associated with maximizing, and the maximizing hypothesis in this case is maximizing profits. So that was the motivation of companies. It's not a very realistic hypothesis, having said that. Even when it was first proposed, it wasn't that realistic, because business people simply don't know what their precise costs are, or they can't vary the price in the marketplace as smoothly or as rapidly as would be suggested by the model. And it also requires very strict rules to apply before a company can maximize profits. Specifically, its marginal revenue must equal its marginal cost. Its marginal revenue must exceed its average variable cost, and its marginal cost curve must be upward sloping. Now, we don't have to go into those here, but most business people and business leaders will not know precisely where their marginal revenue and marginal cost curves are, and if they intersect, or if they're near that point. So it's a useful academic model, a starting point. As output grows, the cost of production may decline, And this is known as economies of scale. Now that's something we can relate to, and it comes to us from economics. It probably comes to us not just from economics but from engineering as well. But as output expands, costs tend to decline. Workers become more adept at producing the product. There's learning by doing. They become more skillful, and more precise machinery can be brought to bear on the problem, and specialist departments and various technological improvements can be made to the production process as the company expands. And these are known as economies of scale. As firm grows in size, costs may fall, and this may lead to the growth of the firm. So larger companies will have lower costs, and that will give them an advantage in the marketplace. They will be able to outcompete the more high-cost companies. So those companies will therefore continue to grow. Now, let's introduce a concept here called the minimum efficient plant size, MEPS, the minimum efficient plant size. Firms that operate at the minimum efficient plant size have a competitive advantage over firms that are either too small or too large. If companies are too small, their costs are going to be higher. They haven't got the full advantage of economies of scale. They haven't got the full advantage perhaps of the division of labour. They're not organising themselves sufficiently and bringing in specialised workers or specialised machinery. So if the companies are too small, they're going to be high cost. Companies can also be too large. Once companies get beyond a certain point, they start to become bureaucratic. They start to become inefficient in their procedures, and the management are unable to effectively communicate with the workers, and issues arise. The workers don't feel loyal to the company, perhaps because they don't feel valued within the company. The company is too large. There's enemy amongst the workers. They feel that they are not, they don't relate to the company. They're not valued. So companies can get too big. They can be too small or too big. So there is an optimum size, the minimum efficient plant size. The government in the UK tried to encourage firms to grow, including through mergers, throughout the 1960s and the 70s. There was a lot of effort by governments over that period to try and get companies to merge. But of course, there are other issues that need to be considered as well. If companies do merge, there's going to be less companies. Less companies means less competition. So prices may be forced up against the consumer's interest. So there's less competition. The dream of the government, the hopes of the government at the time, was that through mergers, output would expand and costs would be reduced, which would lead to cheaper products. But you could argue that if companies merged, there would be fewer companies and therefore less competition and higher prices. The advantage of the small firm sector as a flexible and innovative source of production and employment were broadly overlooked. Throughout the 1960s, governments didn't pay too much attention to the small business sector. It was seen as necessary and was seen as good to be there, but it wasn't singled out for any particular attention. So it was broadly ignored. Governments were more interested in companies that were growing fast, were large, employed a lot of people, a lot of workers. Governments tend to focus in on those. They were not too worried about the small business sector. They didn't get involved with it. So this ideal size, well, it's a balance between economies of scale, economies of size, and what's known as diseconomies of size, diseconomies of scale. Um, as I said earlier, economies of scale come about through the use of specialized machinery. Larger companies are able to negotiate better terms in the banks, get loans cheaper, specialist workers, um, better research and development, better market research. So as companies grow, their average costs tend to fall. But at some point, the companies become too big. And once they become too big, as I said earlier, there's a problem about managing and controlling larger companies. And that's when we have the onset of diseconomies of scale, diseconomies of size. And this is called the long run average cost because it's long run. It doesn't really exist as such. It's an imagined curve. It's one that it's a planning horizon, as some economists call it. It's looking to what's likely to happen into the future. If companies grow, they will become more efficient, costs will fall. But at some point, they will become too big. And at that point, costs will rise. In general, small firms were seen as lacking the potential for growth and were therefore not fully appreciated within the economy. It may have been a prejudice on the part of governments, but they did see small businesses as not really capable of employing a lot of workers. Uh, the problem here is that governments may have been looking at individual small firms, but if we think of the small firm sector in total, employment is considerable. It's massive. So governments, in ignoring small firms, were really ignoring the true full picture. The small firm sector is a large employer of workers. But in looking at one firm as, let's say, typical of small firms, they would find that that one small firm only employs a few workers, and hence the governments preferred to concentrate their efforts on larger firms. So to that end, small firms were ignored. The owner-manager structure is limited in potential, and that's one of the reasons why governments were happy to see small firms in existence but didn't pay too much attention to them because they were seen as an owner who was the manager. In general, the owner manager may be more focused on the organizational issues involved in the everyday running of the business. This preoccupation may preclude any strategic or entrepreneurial thinking and thereby limit the amount, limit the growth, I should say, the long-term growth and potential of the business. So any amount of work going into this firm in terms of research and effort on the part of government was seen as a waste because these were small businesses and the manager, the owner who became the manager of the business was generally speaking perhaps very focused on doing some small activity. They were not seen as particularly entrepreneurial. They were not seen as particularly important in terms of employment potential, international trade, fighting international companies and growing big and powerful. So probably for that reason, or one of the reasons, they were ignored. Many small businesses are run by individuals who prefer a small scale of operation. To these individual factors, such as independence, sense of achievement, and control, may override the drive for growth and profits. Some companies want to stay small. The person who starts the business becomes the manager. They don't want to lose control of the business. They want to keep it small, and they're happy with with that sort of structure. They don't want large business. They want to keep it small, and for that reason, again, governments were reluctant to get involved with the small business sector. By definition, small-scale businesses cannot benefit from economies of scale. So, if they're small scale, they're going to have higher costs. They won't be able to bulk buy the raw materials and get discounts, or buy in specialist machinery or specialist skilled workers, or negotiate advantageous terms from the banks. These are all possible when companies are growing and growing fast and gaining these advantages of economies of scale. So economies due to size and growth of the business are not present in the SME sector to any great extent. They're not there. And this inhibits the growth of the sector. So it's difficult for the small business sector to grow through those type of efficiencies, gaining advantages of economies of scale. So the governments saw small businesses as small and likely to continue as small, and the governments throughout that period, in the 1960s in particular, were probably more interested in growing larger firms so that they could compete with companies overseas, and they would go on to make significant contributions to employment within the area, within their specialist area, and hence, of course, within the country in total. These factors, or there are factors, I should say, that affect the growth of small businesses. For example, in general, it may be the case that small businesses may serve a local market or a small market. In either case, the growth potential of the business will be restricted. So it's likely to be the case that some small businesses can never really grow. They're aimed at some niche small market and they can't really expand. Depends on the nature of the business, but we can envisage a business in a small town serving a local community. It's unlikely that that business can grow and expand, and so it's likely to be the case that the government would recognise it as doing a good job and recognise its contribution, but the government's attention will be focused in on bigger companies doing bigger, more entrepreneurial things, trying to gain a foothold in perhaps foreign markets and replace imports. So the government was aiming higher up, companies that have benefited from economies of scale. Despite these negative points, there was also a view that small businesses had some desirable features. Small firms are more flexible and capable of adjusting to change in the economy. Well, it's certainly the case. I said this earlier in this session. When the economy hits a problem, and let's say a recession is setting in, larger companies tend to be locked in. They're locked into a certain set of products, and these may be adversely affected. So the companies may be adversely affected, and some of the companies may suffer considerably due to variations in macroeconomic activity. But small firms, they're more flexible. They're able to manage the situation much more because they're small, they're flexible, they have less capital to worry about, their employees are more versatile and prepared to take on a range of tasks, and so they've got a better chance of surviving when recession hits. Because of the close working ties between the small firms and the sorry, between the small firms, I put in these question marks because I was questioning if there were more closer working ties between the small firms. I put into question marks to pose the question that firms may not still want to collude. They may want to keep their products separate. They may be still afraid of someone stealing their ideas. So even though this point is going on to say because there are close working conditions within the small firm sector, that may or may not be the case. However, if it is, the firms will enjoy better employee relations as compared to larger firms. So, generally speaking, small firms will have better working relationships with their employees. There's less likelihood of strikes, even less likelihood of unionization within small firms. The manager knows the workers, knows what their worries are and what they want and what their motivations are. So the small firms may be more interested in the workforce and have greater stability as a consequence. They may enjoy more loyalty, motivation and flexibility by the staff. So say the close working ties within the small firm, that's a question mark. They may not exist. It depends. It depends on the attitude of the owner. If we talk about close working relationships between the small business communities within a given area, that may be limited as well, because they don't want their ideas stolen. They don't want necessarily to help each other because they think if they're in the same sector and they go out of business, there's an opportunity for them to expand. So the question marks are simply to indicate that this may or may not be the case. So we'd have to carefully deal with this point. It may be easier for small firms to become niche suppliers to large firms. Small component manufacturers are a feature of many industries, most notably the automobile industry. So the car industry, for example, the car works and lorry production, in fact right throughout the whole automobile industry, what we find is a lot of specialist small firms, medium-sized firms as well, who have come into the market to produce components for the larger firms, and they are in a sense the assemblers of the final product. So it's easy for small firms to do that, and for that reason small firms have an advantage. They've got desirable features. So if we look at those 3 points just briefly, because in the context of what we've been doing up to now has been very critical towards small business, these 3 points simply state that small businesses have advantages in terms of their flexibility and their endurance, because they can stay the distance, they can stay working when the economy has a problem. Not all of them, of course. Some may suffer the same as every other company, but some may enjoy flexibility. They may enjoy the fact that they're able to manage their affairs very tightly, control the situation very tightly. So if the macroeconomy is experiencing problems, the small firms will still exist. The second point, they could have better working relationships within the company, because the manager knows the workforce. The workforce are loyal, more motivated, they're loyal, so there might be that advantage. They might have working ties with other companies, small companies within the area. But as I said with the question marks, maybe, maybe not. So we have to be careful about that one. And the third point was, it's easier for small firms to become suppliers to large firms, because the large firms don't want to produce everything. Perhaps some parts of their uh, component requirements would mean that they're setting up small parts of their company to produce small amounts of something that goes into the bigger product. It's far better and cheaper and more efficient for them to buy them in from outside sources, perhaps from the small business community. Now, the emergence of the small business sector. Well, as previously mentioned, the small business sector was broadly ignored by governments and academics until probably the Bolton Report in the early 1970s. In this period, there was a growing disenchantment with the large conglomerates created in the 1960s. They were not producing the growth rates expected of them, and they were increasingly seen as inflexible and bureaucratic. So somewhere in the 1970s, after the Bolton Report of 1971, but somewhere in the 1970s and onwards, there was much more attention paid to small companies, and a lot more research by academics into the issues confronting small businesses. Issues about sources of finance and about their ability to handle small situations, small workforces, and just generally doing a lot more research into this feature of small business, the feature of small business which enable them to continue with limited resources, limited plant, fewer workers, and does this mean that they are somehow distinct from larger companies? Do they follow a different set of rules, different set of principles? So there was much more interest in small firms from, say, certainly from about the mid-1970s onwards. Small business units were seen as more human and capable of surviving in a changing economy. I say more human, probably not the right word either, but they were seen as people could relate to them. They could relate to small companies. They understood the small company because they perhaps knew the manager, the owner, the person who set it up. They knew the staff in the company. It was much more accessible. Large companies were more bureaucratic, more aloof. They were difficult. They were difficult to gain entry or to find out what was going on, what were the issues. Some of the larger companies had a reputation for disputes with the workforce and strikes, and there were issues. But small companies, these were seen as friendly, straightforward organizations. So when I say human, more approachable, perhaps, would be a better way of putting it. Ernst Schumacher published quite an interesting book back in the 70s, Small is Beautiful, and became influential in the period. And from this point onwards, small business was seen as important. The idea of small is beautiful. The idea that we don't need large corporations. We shouldn't pay too much attention to the large ones at the expense of the smaller business. That the heavy emphasis throughout the 1960s on getting companies to merge and trying to get them to grow and expand, and perhaps that was overdone. More attention should have been paid to small business. So that book in particular became very popular, particularly in business circles, but also in the academic circle, and of course that in turn influenced political thinking. So there was much more awareness of the needs and requirements of small business. The frustration with the large organizations was based on three factors. The growth of firms by merger and acquisition was not always financially successful. There were um, often reports that companies who merged or one who acquired another uh, ran into problems, shortages of funding, or perhaps the synergy between the two was not as was expected. Perhaps the research into the whole process of merging and or the process of acquisition had not been fully worked out. So it was felt that some companies were just rushing into it, and it wasn't working out. It was wasting resources. It was actually endangering some companies. Some companies who were doing well but then risked their resources to merge with another company. And then the larger company, the merged company, would hit a problem. And the problem could be lack of coordination, lack of agreement between the management, the workers feeling more alienated, suppliers not sure about the new organization or its rules and procedures. So growing by merger and acquisition was not always seen as a good thing. Many large firms were merely a collection of plants, and these were similar to the collection of small firms. This meant that the rationale for growth through acquisition and merger was questioned. If companies were producing many different products for the market, it was in a sense, it's very similar to having small companies producing those products. So why should companies try to grow through merger or acquisition? Because in a sense, the one company was acting like several small companies, because they were producing particular products that could have been produced by a small company, but they might be producing many of them. Because they were producing many of them, they saw themselves as a big company. But really, they were very similar to a whole group of small companies. And a whole group of small companies would never consider merging with a bigger company. So the logic for mergers and acquisitions was questioned. Excuse me. In the 1970s, there was increasing research and findings to suggest that small firms were large employers and that they were innovative. It was also discovered that they make a significant contribution to export earnings. So, small firms could be innovative. Now, it was always felt in the past that small firms were just a local person, perhaps a manager who set up a small firm, had some employees. It was not particularly innovative. It just served the local community or a small market. But when academics started to do research into small businesses, they found that many of them were very innovative and were very also entrepreneurial, in the sense that they could see niches in the market which required particular solutions, and they would come up with those solutions. So far from being docile and slow moving, small firms could be quite dynamic. So the small business sector was starting to attract attention. Important source of employment opportunities as well. The small business sector individually may not employ many, but collectively it implies a lot. It's a major sector in the economy for employment. And that's another good reason as to why this sector should not be ignored. So each individual company might only employ a few people, but as I said, collectively, when we add up the sector, we get a very significant employment level. Supply-side economics emphasize the importance of creating a climate in which businesses would develop and expand, emphasize the need for tax cuts, reducing bureaucracy for startup firms, more training, and so on. Now, when we talk about supply-side economics here, that's called a policy in macroeconomics. Macroeconomics from the end of the Second World War was dominated by what's known as Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes. And that was demand-side economics. Keynes felt that if there was unemployment, the government should spend more. And by spending more, that would work its way through the economy. People would have more money to spend and they would buy more products, creating a demand for labour and thereby reducing unemployment. However, there were problems with Keynesianism throughout the 1970s, and the major problem being that of inflation. Now, I'm not going to get too involved with macroeconomic debates in this context. Those are for other videos elsewhere. But the alternative policy to Keynesianism that was put forward is based on what was known as supply-side economics, economics trying to increase the supply on the market. And this paid a lot of attention to the motivation of the business community, so it tried to cut taxes. It also cut taxes for ordinary workers, because that would give them more incentive to look for work and to find good employment and stay with companies. But it would also try to cut the bureaucracy for startups, to try and make it easier for people to start up businesses, because in that way there'd be more employment in the economy. So the government was now putting more effort into trying to start businesses and support businesses, which is known as supply-side economics. This, of course, meant that the government was really supporting small business. So government was finally looking to small business as part of the solution for unemployment in the economy. And the government was promoting small business through these measures. Needless to say, other companies, larger companies, would benefit as well. But small companies would benefit considerably from these measures. And that was one of the changes in the economy. The only real drawback of the supply side policy was the fact that many small businesses fail shortly after being first established, and also many do not employ significant numbers. So that's one of the drawbacks. The government, in trying to encourage business startup, has to recognise that quite a big proportion of startups will fail. They fail for all sorts of reasons. Perhaps the person starting the business was too optimistic, they overestimated the size of the market, perhaps they didn't have a robust business plan, they didn't identify the niche correctly, they didn't have the know-how to run the business. There are many issues that small business people confront. And in supporting small businesses, it has to be recognised that a lot of them will still fail, and they fail very quickly from startup. Encouraging small business entrepreneurs is now well established as a part of many governments' economic policy. So governments throughout the world recognise small businesses as important and try to encourage the small businesses. Small business firms as a source of research and development and innovation is contentious. It's debatable. Small firms don't have the resources for research and development. And small firms try not to take too many risks with innovation because it's dangerous to have limited resources and they don't want to run too many risks. So by and large, small firms tend to go for more traditional items of production or more traditional services rather than innovate or engage in perhaps costly research and development, which is very risky. It may yield a return or it may not. So, many small firms fail to innovate and instead prefer to stay with tried and tested products. There's a variety of reasons for this. The management of small firms may not have the expertise necessary to innovate. Many owners of small firms, they don't have the skills to innovate. They know what they're doing, they know the product they're making or proposing to make, but they can't vary it too much. The management may be reluctant to commit resources to take risks with new products and innovation. So small companies have limited resources and they may be reticent in using those resources for risky research and development, which, as I said earlier, may yield a result or it may not. So there's a big risk with it. So they prefer not to engage in that type of risky management. So they may not be able to afford research and development expenditure, and not just a reticence to take on the risk associated with it, but simply may not be able to afford it anyway. They haven't got the resources. Small firms may not be capable of breaking into new markets because they lack the advantages of economies of scale. They can't negotiate favourable terms from the banks or on supplies of raw materials. They're too small as a company. They can't afford to have specialist machines made for them. So they haven't got the advantages of economies of scale. In this context, it's worth noting that the advent of new technology may, in some cases, destroy the advantage of economies of scale for larger firms. For example, the ability to design, desktop publish, communicate from a standard PC, all of these issues, all of these developments, I should say, all of these have happened probably in the last 20 odd years. But this means that small firms are now able to use very sophisticated technology, particularly firms who are supplying services. They're able to use resources both online and offline. They're able to use very advanced office packages. They're able to produce reports of very high quality. So the advantage that large firms had in terms of some of their technology and processes, that may have been eroded to some extent by the advent of the more popular technologies, computing, internet and so on, that have developed. The management of small businesses may be deterred from innovating because of the lack of expertise in getting patent protection or patent protection, as some people say. So patent protection means being able to protect the idea. So if somebody gets a good idea, a good commercial idea, they may be able to protect it legally to stop others from using it, so that they're able to make considerable profits in the early years from selling this particular item. And it's felt it's only fair that that should happen because they were the ones to come up with the idea. But small firms might find it difficult in getting that protection. It's It does require a certain expertise and a certain determination to be able to achieve that type of legal protection. So those are some of the issues associated with that particular, um, the importance of small business sector, that particular part of uh, our consideration. Now, on the other hand, small businesses may innovate. I just said there are lots of obstacles to it and lots of issues, but they may innovate because this form of structure is ideal for innovation because of its flexibility. Now, this is just contradicting everything I've just said in the previous slide, but some firms may find the flexibility a big advantage. In a dynamic and changing economy, small businesses are seen as more capable of adoption to the changing circumstances. So I know it sounds like it's contradicting the previous one, but it's not, because the small business sector is so large and there's such a variation in terms of the types of firms there are within the sector, some of whom may be interested in innovating, and some of whom may be seen as quite dynamic and forward-thinking and interested in developing new ways of working or new ways of completing certain tasks. So not all the small business sector will have the failings or the issues that we reviewed on the previous slide or slides. Some may have the capacity to innovate. That's the point. So it's not really contradicting it, it's just now uh, making all of us aware of the fact that the small business sector is not homogeneous, it is highly variable. Some firms within that will be innovative. Perhaps the majority won't, for the issues we discussed earlier, but some will. Small business is considered to be ideally structured to innovate since they are less bureaucratic and their procedures in their procedures, and they have superior communication channels within the firm as compared to large firms. So they have good communication channels because it's so small. The owner manager is able to speak with the employees directly, face to face. It's a small firm. Large firms, it's difficult for the management, the senior management, to communicate with the line managers even. But they're also able to innovate because they're less bureaucratic. There's less paperwork and less procedures to follow. So again, there may be advantages in being small, and as I said, this may apply to some firms within the small business community. Small firms generally have a workforce that empathizes with the objectives of the business. The enthusiasm and dedication of the workforce make this form of business structure ideal for innovation. It's certainly the case that in some small firms the workforce will be very enthusiastic about the business and very interested in coming up with ideas how to improve the product or how to improve the workflow. Or they may see the owner manager almost as a friend that they want to support. Now, that doesn't happen in larger firms, so that's also an issue to be borne in mind. So it does suggest that there's no definitive pronouncement can be made on whether small business is good or bad at innovating and bringing about changes in the economy. This particular set of slides, the ones here dealing with these issues that I've brought up, these three issues above, it serves to remind us that the small business sector, as I said, is not homogeneous. It's highly heterogeneous. Some firms within that will be innovative, Some firms will be looking for new ways of doing things. Some firms within there will be very conservative, worried about taking risks, worried about investing in innovation and change because they don't want to risk what they've got. Other firms will look to risking because they want to innovate, they want to change, they want to have a niche that's big and growing and important. And they enjoy the reputation of having this innovative uh, image within that sector. Now, the problems facing small firms, well, there are several problems facing small firms. The firms may have a restricted skill base. Fewer workers and less specialization within the firm may restrict its development. Some companies need particular types of workers with particular skills, and they may find it difficult to get those workers. Some companies within the small business area may find that the workers don't want to work for small companies, they want to work for larger companies where there's more job security, perhaps higher remuneration. So they may have problems also finding suitable premises. Rents, commercial rents may be very high for some firms and they can't take that on board. So they may find it difficult to find areas in which they can work and promote themselves. So the banks may also be reluctant to lend to small firms because they're not seen as having sufficient resources or sufficient market presence. And the banks don't want to take a risk in lending to small, risky firms. And even though that may not be entirely true, the banks may still not want to lend to small firms, even though the firms are perhaps growing and enjoying a good reputation in the market. The banks may still worry about, just in case something goes wrong, the ability of the business to repay its loans and its obligations may be very restricted. Smaller firms have higher production costs of their ability to capture, because of their ability to capture economies of scale, or their inability to capture economies of scale. We talked about that earlier. It's the case that higher production costs are normally associated with smaller firms. As the firms grow, they are able to gain the advantages of division of labour, specialist machines, discount on bulk buying. They're able to gain considerable economies. Small firms, generally speaking, tend to be more high cost. They also have a restricted product range, sometimes only one product perhaps, and this makes the firm vulnerable to changes in the market. So it could be the case that some of the small businesses only have one product, as I said, and if the customers turn against it, the business is gone. It's even if they have a range of products, they're still vulnerable because their resources are going to be stretched over that range of products. So the organization in total may be more vulnerable. So they have got an issue in terms of their range of products that they can use. Now, the measures to help small firms, well, these are some examples of the ways in which small firms may be helped. These examples are based on initiatives put in place by the UK government over the past 20 years or so. They may be grouped under three broad headings. The government has made it easier for firms to obtain finance through various schemes, and also reduced the rate of taxation on small firms. So the government has tried to help small firms by enabling them to get finance easier, but also it's reduced its taxation rate on smaller firms to try and encourage them to set up. The government also provides advice and information to small businesses to help them confront all the issues that are going to face them. For example, negotiating with the bank, the type of business organisation, should it be a limited company or partnership or sole trader, employment law and their obligations when employing staff, all sorts of issues, and the government can supply advice and information to small businesses on these issues. The government attempts to simplify and reduce bureaucracy involved in running small businesses, to attempt to reduce and simplify the number of forms to be completed, and generally make the business simpler to manage and run. So governments try to reduce bureaucracy and thereby encourage people to set up business. If it's very difficult to run a business, if there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of form filling required by governments and different agencies, it may put people off. So the small business community may shrink as a consequence of enforced bureaucracy. So governments try to make it as easy and as straightforward as possible. So in this video we've looked at all sorts of issues confronting small firms and advantages, disadvantages, and it's well worth going over this video a few times and making your own notes from the slides. Write them up in your own way and have them available for assessment purposes. It's a very important issue, the whole issue of small businesses and the importance of small businesses, and it's well worth having the points made in this particular video available. So break up the points and have them available as part of your own study material. But that's all we're going to deal with here, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.